Hey guys, it's Illuminastic, and welcome to part 2. It's been several months since the last part of this stream. Suddenly getting no monitoring in my headphone. Okay, there we go. But I decided to do it again tonight because it is just an amazing subject, and I think it's a super important subject. And it's also something that's really widely misunderstood. A lot of people feel like there's really negative connotations associated with Aleister Crowley and the Book of the Law and all of the sort of associated stuff. And the reality is, I think that it is, regardless of your personal feelings towards Aleister Crowley or your suspicions about what may or may not have happened, it's kind of a case of separating the art from the artist and recognizing that there is an absolute evolution. This is a much more sophisticated form of spirituality. It does, at least to my eyes, represent an actual advance, a great step forward, at least relative to the rest of the old Aeon spiritual and religious systems that, we all see where that got us. And it's probably the most important aspect of it for me is the removal of a hierarchical system. So, the individual will is absolutely and totally sovereign, and there's no authority. There's no one that can command you to do anything at all. You are completely and totally supreme, and that comes with it the sort of charge to acknowledge. It's implicit in this idea that you have to acknowledge the sovereignty of other people. So a lot of people criticize this idea that it's a license to do whatever you want and that it's removing all morality. But what it's actually doing is refining the scope and the resetting the parameters of what morality means. And it's taking the right, which has never really been a right. It's always been, as Bob Marley said, all governments are illegal. And all governance is illegal. And so we as individuals have the responsibility to attain to a level of self-control and a knowledge of self, gnosis of self, that allows us to wield this responsibility in a way that this sort of utopian circumstance is possible and permissible. And, the garden will weed itself, is the response to the people that may say, well, not everyone is going to, rise to the height of their halo. High is the way, but all eyes are upon the ground. And that's just not true. Not all eyes are on the ground. Many may be, but certainly not all. And it really does seem like we're in a time where, a lot of very significant choices have to be made by all individuals. We're certainly in a sort of diaspora situation, and there's a lot of division and a lot of confusion and a lot of reformulation. And I believe that a new order has no choice but to coagulate out of the chaos. It's either that or complete and total destruction. So, we have our choices. So last time we made it to the fourth verse, which is crazy because I think I did like 45 minutes. And remember that each one of these verses is really only just one sentence, most of them. So we spent 45 minutes doing commentary to Crowley's commentary, and so we only made it to verse 4. And this is probably my favorite one in the entire Book of the Law. It's a tough call because there's quite a few bangers as far as the chapters go in the book, but this one makes some points that are extremely important and extremely powerful. And there's one of the fundamental, I guess, operating the modus operandi of this whole system is that it is not necessary uh, in New Aeon spirituality to abandon reason and common sense and to disregard science in order to have a sort of spiritual life, as was required of you to believe in the Bible or the Quran or any of these old Aeon systems, where you kind of had to suspend your credulity and intelligence and common sense and believe in the abjectly ridiculous in order to maintain your faith. That is being completely destroyed by these systems, and that should be the case. And so not only that, we learn that it's from observation of the natural world, and particularly and primarily the dictate of number, the rule of number and the governance of number is a primary focus in this system. So we're going to get to a little bit of a video on the Fourier integer series, which is an extraordinary tool, I guess, and it really, the video that I'm going to show you really demonstrates the sort of practical application, and as it says in the Book of the Law, you know, your success will be your proof. And so having a visual demonstration of a statement like every number is a soul and has a function, it's not just, you know, a marker in an integer series. There's a deeper reality to these, and that matters. The understanding of that reality of number actually matters. And so verse number 4 of the Book of the Law is simply, every number is infinite, there is no difference. This is a great and holy mystery. Although each star has its own number, each number is equal and supreme. Every man and woman is not only a part of God, but the ultimate God. The center is everywhere and the circumference nowhere. The old definition of God takes new meaning for us. Each one of us is the one God. This can be only understood by the initiate. One must acquire certain high states of consciousness to appreciate it. And, you know, this is what I was saying about the removal of the concept of hierarchy. It is no longer to be, you know, observed that there is some voice in your head that has jurisdiction over you. And this would remove so much evil from the world, just to dispel this belief that if you have a voice in your head, you know, that you should follow its dictates. Because if we no longer believe that there's a hierarchical spiritual system, then there's no one to answer to. And so, and this is another aspect of this that I think is so valuable, is that the recognition of this also, you know, limits your conduct to a certain extent, because you cannot overpower or overrule. You have no jurisdiction over another person's will. And so there's this necessity to have sovereignty that does not conflict with the rights of others. And this actually is not as difficult as you might imagine, because as it turns out, every single system in the universe tends towards homeostasis. And there are all sorts of natural laws and rules that govern the behavior of all of these constituent elements of the universe. And so, you know, stars very often collide. There's no, you know, this is something that doesn't really happen in the astronomical universe. Each has an orbit that is necessary, and that star cannot overrule its orbit. It is constrained to move within that path by forces even greater than that star. And so all of these laws are relevant to each constituent element of the universe. Every man and woman is a star is another line from this book that goes along those lines. And so I'm trying not to go through this entire comment line by line, because there is a tremendous amount of it, and some of it I think is a bit superfluous. It's not really, as Isreal Regardie referred to it, it's hideous garbling. in part, where things are just kind of over explained to the point of just ludicrousness. I also want to mention, though, that I'm going to do another version of this for patrons. It's going to go into a lot more depth. The yokel is no more petty than the king, nor the earth than the sun. Each simple elemental self is supreme, the very God of very God. In this book is truth most insufferably splendid, for man has veiled himself too long from his own glory. He fears the abyss, the ageless absolute, but truth shall make him free. And this is, again, this reference to the fact that there is no hierarchy, that if God was consciousness that exploded into gazillion little bits, every piece of that is just as much the Most High God as every other part of it, just as much as my finger is just as much as my part of my body as my ear. And all are necessary fundamentally. So it must be understood from the beginning that this book contains the keys of all the knowledge necessary for the operation of the formula of the world during the aeon which it initiates. In this very early verse is given a master key to mathematics and metaphysics. On applying this to current problems of thought, it will be discovered that long, fast doors fly open at a touch. Let us briefly examine the implications of this statement. It should not occasion surprise to find that the Book of Law not only anticipates the conclusion of the greatest modern mathematicians like Poincare, but goes beyond them. It was necessary that this should be the case, so that the book might be, beyond question, the expression of a mind possessed of superior powers to any incarnated mind whatsoever. And this may sound extremely arrogant, but we have to remember that the premise of the book is that Crowley is channeling basically directly from the light. And that's really the deep secret of all the mystery traditions, that the light is the source of our consciousness, that the electromagnetic wave is the word that's described as the Logos in the Old Testament. And we will see exactly how it is that a single wave in a circle that has lines consisting of different integers can create anything that you can conceive of in the entire universe. And so it is this collaboration between what the Egyptians and Crowley called Nuit and Hadi, the masculine and feminine principle, the point and the circle, potential and the actualization, all of these different ways of describing the what is symbolized by Nuit and Hadi. We're going to actually look at a mathematical model, computer simulation of how that actually happens in a minute. Oh, but what I was saying about that is that he's not claiming that his mind, just to be clear, is possessed of superior powers to any incarnated mind whatsoever. He's saying that these ideas are coming directly from the light, from the math itself, basically. It may clarify the subject if we venture to paraphrase the text. The first statement, every number is infinite, is on the face of it a contradiction of terms. But that is only because the accepted idea of a number is not being a thing itself, but merely a term in a series homogeneous in character. All orthodox mathematical argument is based on definitions involving this conception. For example, it is fundamental to admit the identity of 2 plus 1 with 1 plus 2. The Book of the Law presents an altogether different conception of the nature of number. And, it is true that through very simple division, it is revealed that each number does, in fact, contain infinity. There's a very simple equation I'm sure you all know that allows you to see that very easily. You can punch into a calculator and it will demonstrate for you that, in fact, every number contains infinity. And this is another expression of that great Hermetic law that the all is in the all. It is a materialization or a manifestation of the idea that the universe is holographic, that the entirety of it is contained in each point of it. And so the value of a system like this is that you are actually learning to see these greater metaphysical truths, and you're making them demonstrable and observable. There's no faith but certainty, because you are able to model and demonstrate the claims of knowledge that you possess. In fact, the fact that we live in a world where people believe that they can make claims of knowledge where they cannot do that, it's remarkably absurd that we share a planet with people that think that actually makes sense. Because clearly it is insane, and the fruit of that insanity has been murder and oppression and war and destruction, and culture is oppressed, and science has been set back hundreds of years. So the dovetailing of science and mysticism is the only really viable solution to this, what has so far been an eternal conflict. Mathematical ideas involve what is called a continuum, which is superficially at least a different character to the physical continuum. For instance, in the physical continuum, the eye can distinguish between the lengths of 1-inch stick and a 2-inch stick, but not between these which measure respectively 1,000 miles and 1,000 miles and 1 inch. The difference in each case is equally an inch. The inch difference is either perceptible or not perceptible according to the conditions. Similarly, the eye can distinguish either the 1-inch or the 2-inch stick from an 1.5 inches, but we cannot continue this process indefinitely. We can always reach a point where the extremes are distinguishable from each other, but they're mean from neither of the extremes. Thus, in the physical continuum, if we have three terms, A, B, and C, A appears equal to B and B to C, yet C appears greater than A. Our reason tells us that this conclusion is an absurdity, that we have been deceived by the grossness of our perceptions. It is useless for us to invent instruments which increase the accuracy of our observations, for though they enable us to distinguish between the three terms of our series and to restore the theoretical hierarchy, we can always continue the process of division until we arrive at another series. On the above grounds, modern thinkers have endeavored to create a distinction between the mathematical and the physical continuum. Yet it should surely be obvious that the defect in our organs of sense, which is responsible for this difficulty, show that our method of observation debars us from appreciation of the true nature of the things by this method of observation. But guess what? This is no longer true. This was written in like 1920. So we actually can use our sense, our perceptible organs, or organs of perception, to see what this all means. And so let's do that now.
Here, we look at the math behind an animation like this one, what's known as a complex Fourier series. Each little vector is rotating at some constant integer frequency, and when you add them together, tip to tail, the final tip draws out some shape over time. By tweaking the initial size and angle of each vector, we can make it draw pretty much anything that we want. And here, you'll see how. Before diving into it all, I want you to take a moment to just linger on how striking this is. This particular animation has 300 rotating arrows in total. Go full screen for this if you can. The intricacy is worth it. Think about this. The action of each individual arrow is perhaps the simplest thing you could imagine, rotation at a steady rate. And yet the collection of all added together is anything but simple, and the mind-boggling complexity is put into an even sharper focus the farther we zoom in, revealing the contributions of the littlest, quickest, and downright frenetic arrows. When you consider the chaotic frenzy that you're looking at, and the clockwork rigidity underlying all the motions, it's bizarre how the swarm acts with a kind of coordination to trace out some very specific shape. And unlike much of the emergent complexity you find elsewhere in nature, this is something that we have the math to describe and to control completely. Just by tuning the starting conditions, nothing more, we can make this swarm conspire in all of the right ways to draw anything that you want, provided that you have enough little arrows. What's even crazier is that the ultimate formula for all of this is incredibly short. Now often, Fourier series are described in terms of something that looks a little different, functions of real numbers being broken down as a sum of sine waves. That turns out to be a special case of this more general rotating vector phenomenon that we'll build up to, but it's where Fourier himself started, and there's good reason for us to start the story there as well. Technically, this is the third video in a sequence about the heat equation, what Fourier was working on when he developed his big idea. I would like to teach you about Fourier series in a way that doesn't depend on you coming from those chapters, but if you have at least a high-level idea for the problem from physics which originally motivated this piece of math, it gives some indication for just how unexpectedly far-reaching Fourier series are. All you need to know is that we had a certain equation which tells us how the temperature distribution on a rod would evolve over time. And incidentally, it also describes many other phenomena unrelated to heat. And while it's hard to directly use this equation to figure out what will happen to an arbitrary heat distribution, there's a simple solution if the initial function.
So we've made our point, basically, and all that was happening in that demonstration is that there was a circle that represents a wave. And there is a line that comes from a point, and then there's another integer that is attached to the end of that line. And so it might be half the size of the one that came before it, it might be 3 times the size of it, but it also moves in a circle as a wave. And so it's difficult to build the bridge between this text and that demonstration, except that I guess the primary thing to focus on there is that once you have established the original integer, 4 is always 4. So it has an identity and a function and an action that it takes in the universe that always means the same thing relative to the act of creation. So, and I didn't realize that he didn't explain in the beginning of that video that what exactly was going on with each one of those little arms. But that's it, basically. You have a rotating arm, and on the end of that, you have another rotating arm in a circle, and on and on and on. And so you can write extremely complex equations that can draw the Mona Lisa, as you just observed. So in the case of a mathematical continuum, its character is such that we can continue indefinitely the process of division between any 2 mathematical expressions whatsoever without interfering in any way with the regularity of the process or creating a condition in which 2 terms become distinguishable from each other. And so the mathematical continuum, moreover, is not merely a question of a series of integral numbers, but of other types of numbers which, like integers, express relations between existing ideas, yet are not measurable in terms of that series. Such numbers are themselves part of a continuum of their own, which interpenetrates the series of integers without touching it, at least necessarily. For example, the tangent of angles made by the separation of 2 lines from coincidence to perpendicularity increases constantly from 0 to infinity, but almost the only integral value is found at the angle of 45 degrees, where it is unity. It is said that there is an infinite number of such series, each possessing the same property of infinite divisibility. The 90 tangents of angles, differing by 1 degree between 0 and 90, may be multiplied 60-fold by taking the minute instead of the degree as the coefficient of the progression, and these again 60-fold by introducing the second to divide the minutes, so on ad infinitum. And so all these considerations depend on the assumption that every number is no more than a statement of relation. The new conception indicated by the Book of the Law is, of course, in no way contradictory to the orthodox view, but it adds to it in the most practically important matter. A statistician computing the birth rate of the 18th century makes no special mention of the birth of Napoleon. This does not invalidate his results, but it demonstrates how exceedingly limited is their scope even with regard to their own object, for the birth of Napoleon had more influence on the death rate than any other phenomena included in his calculations. That may have seemed obscure, but if you just take a second to process what he's saying, we can really understand how it is that science and the current ontological parameters can narrow the vision and perception of humanity to the point where we may understand, in a certain sense, the baseline, integers. We may be able to read the statistics, but there are far more profound influences within what is observable to the modern monkey than is actually observable and knowable. And that's where this kind of like mystical thinking comes. And one of the reasons that this stuff has been so profaned and that people, in the mainstream scientific community view it as the sort of woo nonsense is because the people have lost the kind of education. They don't have the discipline and willpower, probably not even the intelligence level, to have the ability to, create the kind of mind, to build the kind of mind in themselves that can process information in this sort of multidimensional fashion that's required. It's also true that this isn't really new, that the mystery schools have been teaching this kind of thinking since at least the time of Pythagoras. But as far as the average proletariat person, confronted with this kind of thinking, it's just going to break their brain. And the hope and expectation is that with the new evolutionary paradigm, that will change. And I feel that I've observed it myself, that walking around the streets of California or Colorado, you bump into people, you can have conversations that sound a lot like this on a pretty routine basis at this point. There are far more people that have developed their consciousness to be able to process this kind of multidimensional thinking than it would appear, and in large part, I think that the mismanagement of social media at the current juncture is helping to create the illusion that there's actually many less people that have attained to that degree than is obvious. So let's continue a little bit more with this, and I'm going to check in with the chat because I feel like there's something integral, no pun intended, that we haven't gotten to yet. Let's see, we were just talking about Napoleon and the statistics of birth rates that he is not taken into consideration when analyzing, but had more of an influence over than any of the other elements, any of the other constituent influences in those statistics. And we're trying to remedy that by understanding more deeply what these symbols actually embody and the sort of power and influence that they have. Something I forgot to mention earlier, when we're talking about the individual number having a soul or sort of function that is beyond being a place marker in a series of integers, the number 9 is a very, very simple one to look at, how it has the sort of functional numerology. And this is what real numerology is. It is not woo. It's an understanding that, as the universe has a mathematical basis, that the structure is all informed by mathematics, that these numbers can be used to achieve deeper levels of understanding in ways that are surprising from a traditional point of view. And so if you multiply 9 times 9, you get 81. You add 8 and 1 together, it becomes 9 again. You can do this with any multiple of 9, and it will always condense to 9 again. And so numerologically speaking, for example, if you were a Jewish mystic working with gematria, you might multiply the numerical value of, say, Jesus Christ by the number 9 to find out what the truth is. And do you know what happens when you do that? You get 666. Let him who hath knowledge count the number of a man is a reference to gematria. And that is what is being revealed, that this is actually the false prophet, and his number is 666. It also is the value of Messiah and serpent, which is, and this is not something that a human being could have endeavored to engineer, which is another bit of evidence, I think, for the presence of the universal mind and some sort of greater consciousness, or at least a sort of mathematical basis that has meaning sort of inculcated into its structure. It's not just a bunch of integers as the Book of the Law is proposing. So there are, the short digression is necessary. There may be some who are still unaware of the fact, but the mathematical and physical sciences are in no sense concerned with absolute truth, but only with the relations between observed phenomena and the observer. The statement that the acceleration of falling bodies is 32 feet per second is only the roughest of approximations at the best. In the first place, it applies to Earth. As most people know, in the moon, the rate is only 1/6 as great, but even on Earth, it differs in a marked manner between the pole and the equator, and not only so, but it is affected by so small a matter as the neighborhood of a mountain. It is similarly inaccurate to speak of repeating an experiment. The exact conditions never recur. One cannot boil water twice over. The water is not the same, the observer is not the same, and when a man says that he is sitting still, he forgets that he is whirling through space with vertiginous rapidity. It is possibly such considerations that led earlier thinkers to admit that there was no expectation of finding truth in anything but mathematics, and they rashly supposed that the apparent ineluctability of her laws constitutes a guarantee of their coherence with truth. But mathematics is entirely a matter of convention, no less so than the rules of chess or baccarat. When we say that two straight lines cannot enclose a space, we mean no more than we are unable to think of them as doing so. The truth of the statement depends, consequently, on that of the hypothesis that our minds bear witness to truth. Yet the insane man may be unable to think that he is not the victim of mysterious persecution. We find that no reason for believing him. It is useless to reply that mathematical truths receive universal consent, because they do not. It is a matter of elaborate and tedious training to persuade even the few people when we teach of the truth of the simplest theorems in geometry. There are very few people living who are convinced or even aware of the more recondite results of analysis. It is no reply to this criticism to say that all men can be convinced if they are sufficiently trained, for who is to guarantee that such training does not warp the mind? And as we have established already, it most certainly does. There are certain blind spots that are sort of inculcated into the structure of the ontology of science because certain things are taken for granted. And so that is what gives us this very limited perspective that we are currently sort of fighting to overcome within the scientific community. There are definitely blinders placed on the horses so they do not see things that scare them, which unfortunately for humanity is anything they don't understand. When we have brushed away these preliminary objections, we find that the truth of the statement itself is not and cannot be more than a statement of correspondences between our ideas. In the example chosen, we have 5 ideas: duality, straightness, a line, enclosing, and space. None of these are more than ideas. Each one is meaningless until it is defined as corresponding in a certain manner to certain other ideas. We cannot define any word soever except by identifying it with 2 or more equally undefined words. To define it by a single word would evidently constitute a tautology. We are thus forced to the conclusion that all investigation may be stigmatized as obscurum per obscurium. Logically, our position is even worse. We define A as B, when B is DE, and C as FG. Not only does the process increase the number of our unknown quantities in geometrical progression at every step, but we must ultimately arrive at a point where the definition of Z involves the term A. Not only is all argument confined within a vicious circle, but so is the definitions of terms on which any argument must be based. It must be supposed the above chain of reasoning made all conclusions impossible, but this is only true when we investigate the ultimate validity of our propositions. We can rely on water boiling at 100 degrees centigrade, although that may not be true at extremely high elevations like the Baltoro Glacier, where it will boil at 84 degrees centigrade. To return to our so-called axiom, 2 straight lines cannot enclose a space, has been one of the most important discoveries of modern mathematics. That this statement, even if we assume the definition of the various terms employed is strictly relative, not absolute, and the common sense is impotent to confirm it, as in the case of boiling water. For Bolyai, Lobachevsky, and Riemann have shown conclusively that a consistent system of geometry can be erected on an arbitrary axiom, any arbitrary axiom whatsoever. If one chooses to assume that the sum of the interior angles of a triangle is either greater than or less than two right angles instead of equal to them, we can construct two new systems of geometry. And what he's saying there, if you remember this wave, the sine wave that had the little arm tracing and another little arm, whichever distance you assign to that first integer is going to determine 4 and 3 and 2 if that first integer is defined as 1. And so that's basically what he's saying there, is that, you know, once you have predicated anything, then you can build a structure upon the foundation. But that first predicative insinuation is going to define the rest of it. It is commonly imagined by those who have not examined the nature of the evidence that our experience furnishes a criterion by which we may determine which of the possible symbolic representations of nature is the true one. They suppose that Euclidean geometry is in conformity with nature because the actual measurements of the interior angles of a triangle tell us that their sum is in fact equal to two right angles, just as Euclid tells us that theoretical considerations declare to be the case. We forget that the instruments which we use for our measurements are themselves conceived of as in conformity with the principles of Euclidean geometry. In other words, they measure 10 yards with a piece of wood about which they really know nothing, but its length is 1/10 of the 10 yards in question. The fallacy should be obvious. The most ordinary reflection should make it clear that our results depend upon all sorts of conditions. If we inquire what is the length of the thread of quicksilver in a thermometer, we can only reply that it depends on the temperature of the instrument. In fact, we judge temperature by the difference of the coefficients of expansion due to heat of the two substances, glass and mercury. Again, the divisions of the scale of the thermometer depend upon the temperature of boiling water, which is not a fixed thing. It depends on the pressure of Earth's atmosphere, which varies according to time and place to the extent of over 20%. Most people who talk of scientific accuracy are quite ignorant of elementary facts of this kind. It will be said, however, that having defined a yard as a length of a certain bar deposited in the mint in London under given conditions of temperature and pressure, we are at least in a position to measure the length of any other object by comparison, directly or indirectly with that standard in a rough and ready way. That is more or less the case. But if it should occur that the length of things in general were halved or doubled, we would never even be aware of the other so-called laws of nature. We have by no means soever of determining even so simple a matter as to whether one of the events happens before or after the other. Let's not beat relativity to death. I think, you know, that was one of those cases of you know, he was going to go on about relativity, but it's like, you know, do we really need 10 more examples? It's pretty clear what we're getting at here. But then again, it is kind of remarkable when you really look at how limited our ability to make absolute determinations about anything is, and how easily our perception could be completely just, you know, totally out of step with any actual reality. It's pretty humbling. We now return to our text. Every number is infinite. The fact that every number is a term in a mathematical continuum is no more an adequate definition than if we were to describe a picture as a number and so in the catalog. Every number is a thing in itself. I regret to find myself in disagreement with the Honorable Bertrand Russell with regard to the conception of the nature of number, possessing an infinite number of properties peculiar to itself. Let us consider for a moment the numbers 8 and 9. 8 is the number of cubes measuring 1 inch each way in a cube which measures 2 inches each way, while 9 is the number of squares measuring 1 inch each way and a square measuring 3 inches each way. There is a sort of reciprocal correspondence between them in this respect. By adding 1 to 8, and this is where it gets important and interesting, we obtain 9, so that we might define unity as that which has the property of transforming a three-dimensional expansion of 2 into a two-dimensional expansion of 3. And that is one of the lines I'm going to save for my patrons. By the way, hit the like button, share, subscribe. Support us on Patreon. If you join our Patreon, I have been doing, the book should be around here somewhere, but the sort of commentary like this, it's not quite as tedious. It does get kind of tedious, but on Masonic degrees, we're doing degree 28 at the moment, and it's very much along the same lines of, you know, really applying critical thinking and integrating scientific observations and knowledge of the natural world and its laws into our metaphysics. Otherwise, you are just a New Ager. Did I say that out loud? But yeah, so that, you know, unity thus appears as in a possession of two totally different properties. Are we then to conclude that it is not the same unity? How are we to describe unity? How to know it? Only by experiment can we discover the nature of its action on any given number. In certain minor respects, this action exhibits regularity. We know, for example, that it uniformly transforms an odd number into an even one and vice versa, but that it is practically the limit of what we can predict as to its action. Also, the method of application changes the nature of the thing, but there's still a relationship to its original function. If you multiply 8 times 1, you still have 8. But if you use addition, then you have 9. And so the function of unity is not quite identical, although it sort of has a relationship that is perceptible. So even though with number, we get about as close as we can to an absolute reality, there's still this fundamental relativity that we just can't get away from. There's only one conclusion to be drawn from this various consideration. It is that the nature of every number is a thing peculiar to itself, a thing inscrutable and infinite, a thing inexpressible. Even if we could understand it, that's nocturnal sort of monkey. In other words, a number is a soul in the proper sense of the term, a unique and necessary element in the totality of existence. We may not turn to the second phrase of the text, we may now turn to the second phrase, there is no difference. It would strike the student immediately that this on the face of it is a point-blank contradiction of all that has been said above. What have we done but insist upon the essential difference between any two numbers, and show that even their sequential relation is little more than arbitrary, being indeed rather a convenient way of regarding them for the purpose of coordinating them without understanding than anything else. On a similar principle, we number public vehicles or telephones without implication even of necessary sequence. The appellation denotes nothing beyond membership of a certain class of objects, and is indeed expressly chosen to avoid being entangled in considerations of any characteristics of the individual so designated, except that cursory designation. When it is said that there is no difference between numbers, for in this sense I think we must understand the phrase, we must examine the meaning of the word difference. Difference is the denial of identity in the first place, but the word is not properly applied to discriminate between objects which have no similarity. One does not ask what is the difference between a yard and a minute in practical life. We do ask the difference between two things of the same kind. The Book of the Law is trying to emphasize the doctrine that each number is unique and absolute. Its relations with other numbers are therefore in the nature of illusion. They are the forms of presentation under which we perceive their semblances. And it is to the last degree important to realize that these semblances only indicate the nature of the realities behind them in the way in which the degrees on a thermometric scale indicate heat. It is quite unphilosophical to say that 50 degrees centigrade is hotter than 40 degrees of temperature. Temperature are simply conventions invented by ourselves to describe physical states of a totally different order, and while the heat of a body may be regarded as an inherent property of its own, our measure of that heat in no way concerns it. Now, this may be a different line in the Book of the Law, but I could have sworn it says make no difference between one thing or another, because thereby cometh hurt. And so this is one of those really richly layered statements that you find in the book. And, you know, without this commentary, if you just read through this, the book itself is pretty it's difficult to get any clear picture of what's being communicated. That's why it's so remarkable that these single sentences will open up into these, massive commentaries. But make no difference between one thing and any other, for thereby cometh hurt. I always thought that was a remarkable line, but I think that's actually a different line, and we'll eventually chew our way through that one. This one, by the way, is definitely the most technical and tedious. The rest of them are not nearly so difficult, but it's number, right? So it's kind of like the metaphysical math class. We use instruments of science to inform us of the nature of the various objects which we wish to study, but our observations never reveal the thing as it is in itself. They only enable us to compare unfamiliar with familiar experiences. The use of an instrument necessarily implies the imposition of alien conventions. To take the simplest example, when we say that we see a thing, we only mean that our consciousness is modified by its existence according to a particular arrangement of lenses and other optical instruments, which exist in our eyes and not in the object perceived. So also the fact that the sum of 2 and 1 is 3 affords us but a single statement of relation symptomatic of the presentation to us of those numbers. We have therefore no means whatsoever of determining the difference between any two numbers, except in respect of a particular and very limited relation. Furthermore, in view of the infinity of every number, it seems not unlikely that the apparent differences observed by us would tend to disappear with the disappearance of the arbitrary conditions which we attach to them to facilitate, as we think, our examination. We may also observe that each number, being absolute, is the center of its universe, so that all other numbers, so far as they are related to it, are its appendages. Each number is, therefore, the totality of the universe, and there cannot be any difference between one infinite universe and another. And that is where we really get to the heart of the matter. Each number is therefore the totality of the universe, and there cannot be any difference between one infinite universe and another. Each integer contains infinity, just as each individual person contains, trillions of cells. But if you were to divide all the constituent elements of one individual human being, you could continue to divide them for infinity. And the reality is that infinity is infinity. It incorporates everything. So, this is really for those of you that manage to stick with it, to chew through this entire thing. When the Book of Law says that your success will be your proof, when you come to that final realization that, the all is in the all, and we actually have a method of demonstration with number, it is really truly remarkable, because the prediction or the proclamation made by the light in this book is demonstrably true. And I don't know of any other mystical work that contains that level of revelatory revelation where there's actually something that is demonstrable. There's nothing else that exists in my knowledge, and as most of you probably know, I've studied this stuff for, since I was a child, and I've never seen anything else that does this. And of course, this isn't the only instance of this sort of remarkable ability to actually offer a proof of these ancient mystical conceptions. And of course, this is a largely derivative, or you will recognize the concepts as coming from Hermeticism and from the mystery traditions, and that is, of course, where the type of thinking that leads to this kind of understanding has been passed down for thousands of years. And, that makes a lot of people suspicious. Why has it been kept secret? What is all that about? And the reality is that the Christians would tie us to logs and burn us alive if they knew. So, that's the reason that it was secret. It has nothing to do with all of the, evil suspicions that conspiracy theorists have. I'm not saying there aren't lodges that have gone awry and become left-hand path. There most certainly are. But in general, the reason for secrecy was just to protect the knowledge and to protect ourselves from getting ripped apart in the streets. We're almost done here, too. And it's funny because the next one, number 5, if I have to make a whole video about it, it'll only be a minute and a half long. There's really not much to say. Actually, there is plenty to say. I shouldn't say that because I'll probably end up talking about it for another 45 minutes or whatever it's been. So that one really got me, though. I'd forgotten about that he managed to tie it all back into the circle so that we can have that sine wave going and a little integer sticking out, drawing lines and creating our universe. The oscillating wave doing all the work for us. The use of an instrument necessarily implies the imposition of alien conventions. To take the simplest example, when we say that we see a thing, we only mean that our consciousness is modified by its existence according to a particular arrangement of lenses and other optical instruments which exist in our eyes and not in the object perceived. So also, the fact that the sum of 2 and 1 is 3 affords us but a single statement of relation symptomatic of the presentation to us of those numbers. We have therefore no means soever of determining the difference between any two numbers except in respect of a particular and very limited relation. Furthermore, in view of the infinity of every number, it seems not likely that the apparent differences observed by us would tend to disappear with the disappearance of the arbitrary conditions that we attach them to facilitate. We already went through that. This is, we may also observe that each number being absolute is the center of its universe, so that all other numbers, as far as they're related to it, are its appanages. Each number is therefore the totality of the universe, and there cannot be any difference between one infinite universe and another. This also, and the reason I read that again is to remind myself of what it was saying, so that I could point out that this is another reference to the fact that hierarchy is like the greatest lie that's ever been imposed upon humanity. The triangle ABC may look very different from the standpoints of A, B, and C respectively. Each view is true absolutely, yet it is the same triangle. And this is another one of the great mistakes of modern spirituality and its attempts to give everyone space to express themselves and to exist as they must, because it is necessary that an organism has its freedom of expression. Otherwise, it is going to die or it is going to go insane and possibly hurt other organisms, right? So this is, it's necessary to have these things. But we went too far in telling people that your truth is your truth. That's not true. That's either your opinion or your perception, but it's not truth. It's just your opinion or your perception. And somehow, in pop culture spirituality, people have lost touch with that. And there's this belief that you can just sort of think your way into an alternate reality. And that's true to an extent, but not in the way that it's sold to people in these new age books and by these gurus and stuff. It's just not, they've taken it too far. The above interpretation of the text is of a revolutionary character from the point of view of science and mathematics. Investigation of the lines here laid down will lead to the solution of these grave problems which have so long baffled the greatest minds of the world on account of the initial error of attaching them on lines which involve self-contradiction. And this is another great example of, these errors that we have made over time that require rectification and why it's so difficult. When you have built a structure that has a faulty beam, the whole entire structure is only as strong as its weakest length. And so once you have erected a structure, in order to go down into a fundamental piece and remove it and replace it, threatens the entirety of the structure. And that is exactly why we are faced with global collapse at the moment. Because the structures that we have built upon, their foundations, were already rotted wood that were not engineered correctly. So, that is why it is going to take such skill and precision, and odds are stacked against us so much as that we have to go and change the foundation of a building without the building toppling over or crashing in on itself. The attempt to discover the nature of things by study of the relations between them is precisely parallel with the ambition to obtain a finite value of pi. Nobody wishes to deny the practical value of the limited investigation which have so long preoccupied the human mind. But it is only quite recently that even the best thinkers have begun to recognize that their work was only significant within a certain order. It will soon be admitted on all hands that the study of the nature of things in themselves is a work for which the human reason is incompetent. For the nature of reason is such that it must always formulate itself in proportions which merely assert a positive or negative relation between a subject and a predicate. Men will thus be led to the development of a faculty superior to reason, whose apprehension is independent of the hieroglyphic representations of which reason so vainly makes use. That may remind you of a certain Terence McKenna talking about how we need to evolve a new form of language that allows us to speak in 3D. Or, some such, or if you've seen Alison Gray, the wife of Alex Gray, she has made these letters that are, I've seen them, when you take LSD, there's this tendency to see these letters in solid objects, and it was really remarkable to see her having drawn them out, because, I've seen those very same characters as a 15-year-old. So it was like this confirmation that these things exist and that they're the same for everyone. But yeah, so that's an earlier emanation of this idea that we need a new form of language, a living language. But of course, Terence McKenna was, he had read all of this Crowley, and even made a terrible movie about John Dee and Edward Kelly. That he starred in, he didn't say a single word, but he was dressed in Victorian garb and just kind of standing there every time Edward Kelly needed to be in the movie. It was pretty terrible. All right, we're almost through. Development of a faculty superior to reason. This then will be the foundation of the true spiritual science, which is the proper tendency of the evolution of man. The science will clarify without superseding the old, but it will free men from the bondage of mind little by little, just as the old science had freed them from the bondage of matter. Science is the proper and particular study of initiates, and its principia are formulated in the Book of the Law. The book may therefore be regarded as indicating a complete evolution in human affairs, for it advances mankind in the most radical manner. The road of attainment to self-realization is made open as never before has been done in the history of the planet. And that is entirely true. And it's not necessarily that this knowledge is new, because it's as old as Pythagoras, and it's older than Pythagoras. It's as old as Egypt and Syria, Babylonia. But it is also true that we are in a position, because of our access to technology and history and the advancing of sciences like psychology and chemistry, and our access to chemicals and plants, we are certainly in a position, if we so choose, to catalyze our consciousness with a speed and intensity that has never before been possible on this planet. And with that comes a much greater, our responsibility is expanded along with that power. So that is our charge. I wonder if it sounded like that the entire time. I haven't been able to check in with the chat. Oh, so maybe no, it didn't crash. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know what's going on with all this stuff. I guess I should have checked in with the chat earlier, but it doesn't matter that much. I'm going to make a video about this when I have conditions that are a little bit more conducive to concentrating anyways. So thank you guys for spending this time with me, and I will see you again tomorrow. We're going to talk about life in the Amazon, and I will share with you some of my experiences from the cultural immersion with the indigenous and in the Andes, and probably most importantly, what it has made me realize about people in the United States and Europe. Everyone knows that they're insane, but until you get away from them and are able to look back at it, you really don't understand the degree of it and the extent of it. So, yeah, it definitely is very similar feeling to crawling out of a toxic cesspool with a bunch of rabid zombies trying to eat you your entire life and thinking that that's normal. Not really an exaggeration either. Our world has really evolved to the point where it is like a surrealistic. I don't even want to call it a tragic comedy. It's not even a farce. There are really no words to describe the devolution of mankind over the last 50 years or so. Oh, I see. That's odd. It's telling me I have an excellent connection, but it's also telling me that my bit rate is not high enough. I don't know. Anyways, you guys, I will talk to you again tomorrow. Thanks so much. Please hit the like button, share, subscribe, join our Patreon. Join our Discord too. I put the link in the description.